In September of 1808, on a wind-scoured island at the very northern edge of Scotland, the sea gave something back. For 3 relentless days, a violent storm had battered the coast of Stronsay, one of the smaller islands in the Orkney chain, a place where the land seemed almost forgotten between the endless grey waters and the darker sky above. The wind arrived from the north with a fury that seemed unstoppable. It ripped the spray from the tops of waves and hurled it across the fields of heather. It shook the slate roofs of the small cottages and forced the islanders to remain indoors beside their peat fires, listening as the Atlantic roared against the shoreline as if it were trying to tear the island apart. These were people who understood the sea better than most. Their entire lives had been shaped by its moods, its dangers, and its unpredictable power. Yet even they spoke about this particular storm with an unusual sense of unease, as though there was something different about it, something that felt almost deliberate. When the winds finally weakened and the ocean returned to a calmer state, the islanders did what they had always done after a great storm. They walked the shoreline to see what the sea had carried in. Usually it was nothing extraordinary. Pieces of driftwood, broken parts of ships, scattered debris, or perhaps the body of an animal swept away by the waves. They expected to find the ordinary remains of a violent night. But beneath the cliffs, near a place called Rotisholm, they discovered something that would become one of the strangest mysteries in natural history. Half submerged in the water and half resting on the rocks, there lay a massive, unknown creature, stretched across the shoreline like something that had fallen from another world. At first, the men believed they had found a dead whale. Whales were not unknown in those waters, and a carcass washing ashore could provide valuable resources for an island community: oil, bone, and meat. But as they approached the enormous body, their confidence began to disappear. They slowed their steps, they stared, and eventually they stopped completely. Because what lay before them was not a whale, it was not a creature they recognized. It was something that seemed to belong more to legend than reality. The animal was enormous, stretching across the rocks farther than any boat the islanders owned. Its body was long and narrow, tapering toward one end where a surprisingly slender neck extended outward to a small head, no larger than that of a seal. Along its back ran a strange crest of stiff bristles, a structure resembling a mane. Those who touched it later claimed that when the wet fibers caught the fading northern light, they appeared to shimmer with a faint silver glow. But perhaps the most unsettling feature was found along its sides. There were appendages, not ordinary fins, but structures that looked strangely similar to limbs. 3 pairs of them, arranged along the body like the legs of a creature that should never have existed beneath the waves. The men stood silently on the rocks, staring at the impossible shape before them. And then, one of them finally spoke the word that everyone else had already been thinking: Serpent. But these were not inexperienced men searching for a story. They were not children frightened by something unfamiliar, nor sailors exaggerating a tale inside a crowded tavern. They were fishermen and farmers who had spent their entire lives surrounded by the ocean. They understood its creatures. They knew whales, sharks, seals, dolphins, porpoises, and the strange animals that could appear in their fishing lines. They had handled dead creatures before. They knew what decay could do to a body. And yet, when they looked at this creature, they admitted something remarkable. They had never seen anything like it. That was the detail that made the discovery so fascinating. Not the strange mane, not the long neck, not even the enormous size. The most important fact was that the people who were among the most familiar with the sea and its inhabitants could not confidently identify what they were looking at. So they did the one thing they knew would give their discovery credibility. They measured it. A local farmer recorded in the accounts carefully examined the creature's length. He was not making a wild estimate. He was not simply walking beside it and guessing. One measurement was reportedly taken using a carpenter's folding rule, the kind of practical tool trusted by ordinary men to build homes strong enough to survive the harsh Orkney weather. They measured again and again because they understood that without evidence, their story would never be believed. The final measurement stunned everyone. 55 feet. A body stretching 55 feet along the rocks of a small Scottish island. To understand that size, imagine standing beside the length of several large vehicles placed end to end. The creature was not simply a large fish. It appeared to be a giant of the deep, a massive unknown animal lying helpless on the shore, while a handful of islanders walked its length with a carpenter's measuring tool and recorded every detail. And as impossible as the discovery seemed, the story did not remain on Stronsay. News traveled across the Orkney Islands, then to mainland Scotland, carried by letters, reports, and word of mouth. With every retelling, the creature became more mysterious. Yet the strange thing was that the truth itself was already unbelievable enough. No one needed to add much exaggeration. Eventually, the story reached the cities of the South, where it stopped being a simple island rumor and became a serious question for science. In the early 19th century, Scotland had a growing community of naturalists, men who collected specimens, studied animals, and attempted to organize the living world into a system of knowledge. When reports of the Stronsay creature reached them, they did not dismiss the accounts as sailors' fantasy. They examined them, the measurements, the descriptions, and the statements of those who had witnessed the creature were recorded carefully. The islanders who discovered it were questioned, and their accounts were taken formally. They were asked to swear to what they had seen, just as a person would swear to the truth of their words in a court of law. For a brief moment, the strange creature found on the shores of Stronsay was no longer just a mystery of the sea. It had become a mystery for science itself. Their words were recorded, preserved, and carefully written down in ink so that they could be examined long after the creature itself had disappeared beneath the waves of time. Think about what that means. This was not an anonymous rumor whispered between sailors in a harbor. This was not a story passed from one frightened person to another until it became something larger than reality. These were testimonies given under oath by named men, men whose reputations were known within their community, men who stood before authorities that considered the matter important enough to demand such a level of seriousness. The entire machinery of credibility that an early 19th century society could provide was brought forward for a dead creature lying on a remote stretch of rock in the far north. And when the naturalists studied those reports, they reached a conclusion that, for one extraordinary moment, made Scotland the place where the impossible had become real. They believed the creature existed. Not a hoax, not a mistake, not a distorted whale carcass misunderstood by frightened islanders. They believed it was a genuine animal, a creature that science had never encountered before, something that had never been described, never been classified, never been placed into the great catalogue of life. Something that had been touched by human hands, measured with a carpenter's rule, and examined like any other specimen brought before the scientific world. So they gave it a name, because naming something is more than simply attaching words to it. In the world of science, a name is a declaration. It means that a thing has crossed a threshold. It means the creature is no longer just a mystery on a shoreline. It has entered the official record of the natural world, and the name they chose carried a message of its own. It was a tribute to an old bishop from Scandinavia, a man who had spent his life arguing something that many educated people of his time considered almost ridiculous. He believed the monsters of the ocean were not merely myths. He believed that beneath the endless surface of the sea, in places humans had barely explored, there could exist creatures that sounded impossible simply because no one had discovered them yet. The bishop had lived a century earlier in the cold northern lands of Scandinavia. Throughout his life, he collected the stories of sailors who returned from the deep waters with unbelievable accounts. They spoke of enormous krakens that appeared like islands rising from the black waves. They described serpents that lifted their bodies above the surface, terrifying entire crews and sending men to their knees in prayer. Most scholars dismissed these tales as the imagination of exhausted sailors who had spent too much time surrounded by endless ocean. But the bishop did not laugh at them. He recorded their stories carefully. He studied them. He argued that the ocean was simply too vast, too deep, and too unknown for humanity to confidently declare what could or could not exist within it. For much of his life and for generations afterward, he was treated as a man who had confused legend with reality, a collector of sea fantasies, a clergyman who had filled his writings with stories of creatures that belonged more to folklore than science. But now, on a storm-battered island at the edge of Scotland, something had appeared that seemed to prove he had been right all along. A creature from the deep had arrived. A body unlike anything known to science had been found. And so, the naturalists honored him by weaving his name into the identity of the beast. It was a quiet but powerful gesture, almost as if they were saying, "You were right. The creatures you believed existed were not merely stories. And here, at last, is the proof you never lived to see." The name they gave it represented the idea of a sea serpent, a great snake of the ocean depths. And for one brief moment in history, it became official. A respected scientific community, filled with men who studied anatomy, measured specimens, and built their careers on careful observation, had accepted the existence of a sea serpent. Not a drawing, not a sailor's tale, not a creature from a forgotten myth. A real animal, a creature with physical remains, with bones that could be examined, and with a body length that could be measured. You have to understand how extraordinary that was. This was not a story told in a crowded tavern after too much drink. This was not an illustration on an ancient map showing a fictional monster with enormous jaws and a curling tail. This was the same scientific process used to identify every known animal on Earth, now being applied to a creature that many people would have believed could never exist. For a brief moment, humanity seemed to have answered one of the oldest questions about the ocean. Was there something unknown hiding beneath those dark waters? Something enormous? Something serpent-like? Something beyond imagination? The answer, according to the evidence before them, appeared to be yes. And here it was, measured, examined, recorded. But nature did not allow the discovery to remain. The carcass itself did not survive. The sea gives, and the sea takes back. The same tides that had carried the creature onto the rocks eventually began to reclaim it. The waves pulled at the massive body, the elements broke it down, and slowly the remains disappeared. The gulls fed upon it. The surf wore it away. The cold northern weather reduced the once mysterious creature into fragments. But not everything was lost. Some pieces survived, vertebrae. The large discs of bone that had formed the creature's enormous spine were recovered and preserved. Fragments of the strange bristled material that ran along its back were also collected. There was enough remaining evidence, the naturalists believed, to support their conclusion. Enough material that could be held, examined and studied by anyone who doubted the discovery. But doubt was coming. Of course it was, because a claim like this, a sea serpent officially named, scientifically catalogued, and accepted by respected scholars, could never pass quietly through the scientific world. It was a stone dropped into a perfectly still pond, and the ripples traveled far beyond the shores of Stronsay. They reached London. They reached men whose entire careers had been built on understanding the hidden structures of living things, men who had spent years cutting open animals, studying their bones, examining their organs, and learning how nature truly worked beneath the surface. And they were not prepared to accept the existence of a sea monster simply because a group of islanders had found something strange on a beach. One man, in particular, stood out. He was an anatomist of exceptional reputation, a surgeon, a scientist who understood the architecture of life from the inside outward. He had examined countless bodies and knew better than most people how easily appearances could deceive. When the reports of the Stronsay creature reached him, the long neck, the small head, the 3 pairs of appendages, the glowing mane, and the astonishing 55-foot length, he did not feel wonder. He felt suspicion, not the careless disbelief of someone refusing to accept something unusual, but the trained suspicion of a man who understood how nature could create illusions after death. He decided to investigate. He would examine the remaining evidence, study the witness accounts, and approach the mystery not as someone searching for a monster, but as someone searching for the mistake that created one. Because before he even began his investigation, he had a theory. He believed he knew what the people of Stronsay had actually discovered. Not a serpent, not an unknown creature from the depths, not the long-awaited proof of ancient sea legends, a shark. More specifically, a basking shark, one of the gentle giants of northern waters, enormous creatures that drift through the ocean with their massive mouths open, filtering tiny organisms from the sea. A familiar animal, a well-documented species, a creature that no one would mistake for a monster while it was alive. But his argument depended on one disturbing truth about what happens after a basking shark dies. Because death transforms creatures, and the ocean is very good at hiding what something once was. A dead basking shark does not decay evenly. The first parts to disappear are the soft structures that make the animal recognizable as a shark. The gills, the powerful jaw, the lower fins. The features that tell the eye exactly what it is looking at begin to break down, loosen, and vanish. And when those parts are gone, what remains is something far stranger. A long, exposed backbone, a small skull resting at the end of it, a shape that no longer resembles the creature it once was, and a few trailing remnants of fin remained behind. What was left was not the recognizable shape of a shark anymore. It was a spine with a small head attached, a long, twisted column of bone stretching across the rocks. And that was the heart of the anatomist's argument. A dead and decaying basking shark did not look like a shark at all. Instead, it looked remarkably similar to the very creature the islanders believed they had discovered. A serpent, a long-necked monster from the deep, a mysterious animal that seemed impossible, yet had been created not by some unknown force beneath the ocean, but by the simple and brutal process of decay. The illusion had a name, or at least, it had the idea behind one. A pseudo-serpent, a false monster, a trick created when a familiar creature is transformed into something unrecognizable by the slow destruction of nature. And once the explanation was presented, it became difficult to see the Stronsay creature the same way again. Every terrifying detail that had convinced the islanders they had discovered something impossible suddenly had another explanation. the strange mane running down the creature's back, the glowing fibers that witnesses had described with such certainty, the details that seemed almost too bizarre to belong to any real animal. The anatomist believed he knew exactly what they were. When a basking shark dies, the skin and muscle begin to disappear, exposing the deeper layers of its body. Beneath the surface are fibrous connective tissues, long, pale strands that can separate and drift loose like coarse hair. In the cold gray light of northern Scotland, wet with seawater and covered in the sheen of decay, those fibers could easily appear unusual. They could shimmer. They could resemble a mane. They could create the illusion of a strange bristled crest running along the back of an unknown sea creature. The very feature that had seemed the most mysterious, the most impossible to explain, became one of the easiest details for an experienced anatomist to understand. And then there were the limbs, those 3 pairs of strange appendages that had disturbed the people who first stood beside the carcass on the shore. To the islanders, they looked like legs, like the limbs of some enormous marine reptile. But the anatomist saw something different. He saw the structure of a shark's body. He pointed to the arrangement of the pectoral fins, the pelvic fins, and the claspers found in male sharks. He explained how, as the surrounding tissues decay and disappear, these structures can remain exposed as paired projections extending from a long, damaged body. 6 limbs, or rather, 6 shapes, that appeared close enough to limbs to a group of frightened men standing on slippery rocks, surrounded by wind, waves, and an unfamiliar carcass. One by one, he dismantled the monster, the mysterious neck, the strange spine, the small head, the unusual skull, the glowing mane, the exposed fibers, the supposed limbs. The entire creature that had seemed beyond explanation was carefully rebuilt into something completely ordinary. Not a sea serpent, not an unknown animal, just the remains of a massive basking shark, a creature that had lived in those same northern waters for generations. It was a powerful demonstration of skepticism, a reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not created by the unknown, but by the familiar becoming unrecognizable. And for much of the scientific community, that was the end of the Stronsay mystery. The serpent was a shark. The monster was a misunderstanding. The great discovery that had briefly shaken the scientific world was quietly returned to the category of natural illusions. The name that had been given to the creature, the tribute to the old bishop, the idea that Scotland had uncovered proof of a legendary sea serpent, all of it slowly faded back into history. The case was closed, or at least most people believed it was, because there was one problem that refused to disappear, one single detail that the basking shark explanation could not completely absorb. One number that remained in the records like a stone sitting at the bottom of a river, untouched no matter how much time passed. The length, 55 feet. A basking shark is an enormous creature. It is the second largest fish in the world, surpassed only by the whale shark. These animals can grow to extraordinary sizes, and their massive presence has amazed sailors for centuries. But even the largest reliably measured basking sharks have limits. Standing beside a 40-foot animal would be an unforgettable experience. It would tower over most humans. It would be longer than many boats. But 40 feet is not 55. There was a difference of 15 feet. 15 feet of missing length that the simple explanation struggled to account for. Of course, the obvious answer was that the islanders had simply measured incorrectly. Perhaps they had been overwhelmed by what they saw. Perhaps the sight of a massive decaying creature lying on storm-covered rocks had affected their judgment. Perhaps, like many stories passed down through generations, the animal had grown larger with every retelling. A fish becomes bigger every time the story travels. That is a familiar pattern, but the Stronsay case was not so easy to dismiss, because this was not a single person making a dramatic claim. The measurements were taken by multiple witnesses. They were recorded formally. They were presented before officials. They were treated with the seriousness of legal testimony. And at least one measurement was made using a carpenter's own folding rule. Not a sailor's guess. Not an estimate made from a distance. A real tool used by a working man, marked carefully in inches, placed directly against the body lying on the rocks. That is not how a rumor is measured. That is how someone attempts to record a fact. And that single number became the strongest argument for those who refused to accept that the mystery was completely solved. They argued that everything else could be explained. The neck, the head, the mane, the strange appendages. They were willing to accept that decay could create a convincing illusion. But the length was different. You can explain the shape, they argued. You can explain the appearance. You can explain why the creature looked like a serpent. But you cannot simply erase 15 feet of measurement, recorded by multiple witnesses, with one of them using a carpenter's rule against the remains. Either the islanders had all made the same extraordinary mistake, or something about the Stronsay creature remained unexplained. And that possibility was enough to keep the mystery alive. Because imagine the alternative. A creature longer than any known basking shark of its kind washed ashore at the edge of the world during one violent storm, lying on the rocks for a brief moment before the ocean reclaimed it forever. A creature that appeared only once. A creature that left behind just enough evidence to create a question that has survived for more than 2 centuries. And yet, despite the strength of the shark explanation, there was one uncomfortable truth that could not be ignored. The Stronsay creature was almost certainly not the sea monster that believers had hoped it would be, because measuring a decomposing carcass is a far more complicated task than measuring a living animal. Death changes things. Bodies do not remain fixed after life leaves them. They stretch, they distort, they collapse in strange ways. The spine can separate, the tissues can loosen. A flexible structure of cartilage, swollen by water and pulled by the movement of the waves, can extend farther after death than the animal ever measured while alive. A trained eye understands this. The skeptics understood it. They knew that a dead creature lying on a shoreline was not always an accurate representation of the living animal that once moved beneath the waves. But there is a difference between understanding how a mistake could happen and proving that it actually happened. And after more than 2 centuries, no one has been able to completely prove that the famous 55-foot measurement was wrong. The surviving evidence from the creature was limited. Only fragments escaped the power of the ocean. A few vertebrae, a handful of hard remains that had once belonged to the strange animal lying on the rocks of Stronsay. Those pieces were preserved, examined, and debated for years afterward. Some researchers looked at the evidence and agreed with the basking shark explanation. To them, the mystery had been solved. The sea serpent was nothing more than the remains of a familiar animal transformed by decay. But others remained uncertain. They questioned whether every detail of the creature could truly be explained so easily. The identification was accepted by some, challenged by others, forgotten, revived, and debated again as each new generation returned to the old mystery. It never completely disappeared. It never settled into the quiet certainty of a solved case. And that is the strange place the Stronsay beast has occupied ever since. A creature caught between